evening, depending on the part of the world where you are. So I'm very pleased to be here with you today. My name is Victoria, and I am a pharmacy academic in the University of Technology, Sydney. So I will be moderating this very interesting session. I'm also the chair of the FIP Pharmacy Practice Research Special Interest Group, and I'm also an associate editor for research in social and administrative pharmacy. So this is one of the webinar series of FIP. As you know, it's under the umbrella of COVID-19, responding to the pandemic together. So these webinars have different objectives, as you can see on the screen. So the main objective is to provide relevant information for pharmacists and the pharmacy workforce on the current situation, share and discuss strategies adopted by pharmacy leaders and workers, discuss current evidence on the pandemic and on certain topics, discuss the implications of the pandemic on issues such as safety, supply, shortages. So there are a range of objectives. We are not covering all of them today, but this webinar is under this umbrella. So if you have any ideas or want to suggest a webinar topic, please feel free to share your ideas with Lina from FIP. You have her email there. So important things before we start. So there is a very useful website on FIP, and you can find all the resources and outputs that FIP has created to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see the link on the slide. And also there is a Facebook group on COVID-19 and pharmacy. And as well, you can see the link on the website, on this slide, sorry. A few things before we continue. So just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and it is also being live streamed on Facebook, and the recording will be available on the FIP website. We will have two speakers, which I will introduce shortly. But as we go through the presentation, there is the questions and answers chat box. So please free to post your questions and we will have time to address those at the end of the presentation. And your feedback is very welcome, so please feel free to share it with us. So in the last months, we have been inundated with a lot of information regarding COVID, the pandemic situation, different treatments, the effectiveness of those treatments, strategies. So hopefully today we will cover a lot of those topics. So we are going to be focusing on two different perspectives. So the first one, from the clinical perspective, we will see what's the current evidence on COVID-19 treatments, what are the key clinical trials that are currently being conducted with a special focus on the Solidarity trial conducted by the World Health Organization and the Recovery trial. We will also discuss repurpose and novel drugs to treat COVID-19. And also from an economic perspective, we will see what's the disease burden of COVID-19, what are the cost and the economic implications from the healthcare perspective. We will discuss cost effectiveness of antivirals for influenza-like illnesses. We will also be discussing two treatments like remdesivir and dexamethasone. And we will also discuss some important implications about stockpiling. So the learning objectives of today's webinar are to evaluate the current state of clinical research and the potential for developing treatments for COVID-19, summarize the key considerations when developing treatments for pandemics, for respiratory illnesses, and to assess the potential clinical and economic value of COVID-19 treatments. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to our first speaker, Sayed Hassan. Sayed is a senior lecturer in the Department of Pharmacy at the University of Huddersfield in the UK, and he's also a senior lecturer in the School of Biomedical and Pharmacy in the University of Newcastle in Australia. So thank you for joining us today, Sayed, and yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to your presentation.
Hello. Thank you, FIP, for giving me this opportunity to speak on this FIP webinar series. Today in my presentation, I would be giving an overview of the drugs that are used to treat COVID-19, focusing on safety and efficacy of the drugs or the drugs used in the clinical studies and in vitro studies, and also briefly discussing the novel drugs and the targets. We all know that COVID-19 disease is caused by a novel coronavirus identified as a severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. But what we don't know is the cure for COVID-19. No pharmaceutical products have yet been shown to be safe and effective for the treatment of COVID-19. There are a number of medicines that have been suggested as potential investigational therapies. These drugs are categorized into repurposed drugs, means the drugs that are used for other indications and they were investigated in trials or clinical studies for the treatment of COVID-19. And then we have novel drugs and targets specifically designed for COVID-19. And then we have drugs for the management of critical cases or severe form of COVID-19, for example, dexamethasone or interleukin-6 inhibitors. We also have vaccines in the development stages for the prevention. But I will be focusing on the drugs for the treatment of COVID-19 used in clinical studies and in vitro studies. Before I discuss the evidence about COVID-19 treatment, I would like to highlight a few important points presented in this table. This table summarizes the 5 different phases of COVID-19, the risk of transmission, treatment, and preventative measures. The transmission is possible in all 5 phases. In case of asymptomatic cases, the evidence is not conclusive, but in the phase of uncertainty, we should take it as possible. Treatment is generally recommended for patients with symptoms starting from mild cases, and the treatment plan depends on the severity of the disease. Many experts believe that coronavirus is airborne. Currently there is a debate going on this topic. So in order to reduce the transmission of virus, everybody should follow the appropriate preventative measure, especially healthcare professionals who are dealing with COVID patients and the COVID positive patients. After the COVID outbreak, thousands of clinical trials were registered to identify the most effective and safe treatment for COVID-19. It is not possible to cover all of them in this presentation, but I would like to discuss 2 important trials, the Solidarity trial initiated by WHO and the recovery trial initiated by the University of Oxford in the UK. Solidarity trial has recruited more than 3,500 patients in 35 countries with over 400 hospitals actively recruiting patients. At the start of this trial, 4 drugs were offered, including remdesivir, lopinavir with and without interferon, and hydroxychloroquine. On the other hand, recovery trial managed to recruit more patients than WHO trial. They also offered 4 drugs for the treatment of COVID-19, and there are 2 drugs for severe form or critical cases as anti-inflammatory drugs. That I would like to discuss is chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. These anti-malaria drugs have long been indicated for chemoprophylaxis and treatment of malaria. And hydroxychloroquine also used as disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drug for rheumatoid diseases. The antiviral effects of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine were first investigated after the first SARS outbreak in 2003, recognizing the lack of therapeutic management. Both drugs, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, have demonstrated in vitro antiviral activity against SARS-CoV-2 virus. In the current pandemic, the first report of clinical use of chloroquine in the treatment of COVID-19 associated pneumonia was reported by Gao et al. From China, and the first trial on hydroxychloroquine was published from France, included 36 patients with a mixed sample of asymptomatic, mild, moderate, and severe cases. However, later serious issues raised about this particular trial, including a small number of patients treated with hydroxychloroquine, only 14 patients, and even a smaller number, 6 patients were treated with a combination intervention group of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. This was the same trial, if you remember, that President Trump has quoted in his press briefing to support the use of hydroxychloroquine. The journal that published this trial also came under serious severe criticism for not following the proper peer review before they published this trial. We did a systematic searching because there were some clinical trials we read. So we did a systematic searching to find the clinical trials available on hydroxychloroquine. We found at least 6 published clinical trials on hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. Exclude the trial. There were 6 trials on treatment and 2 trials on prophylaxis. The results from these clinical trials are conflicting, lacked statistical significance, and recruited a fairly small number of patients. We also performed a Cochrane risk of bias assessment, and we found that 8 trials were ranked as none of them were actually ranked as low risk, while half of the trial had high, severe, or severe risk associated with the trials. On 5th of June 2020, researchers conducting the recovery trial in their press release reported no significant difference between hydroxychloroquine and usual care in the primary endpoint of 28-day mortality, and no evidence of beneficial effect on hospital stay or other outcomes. After 2 weeks of recovery trial, on 17th of June, WHO dropped the hydroxychloroquine arm of the Solidarity trial, but they did not provide any results. On 26 June, the regulatory body in the UK, MHRA, has approved the recruitment of further participants for a new trial, COP-CoV trial, by the University of Oxford, investigating hydroxychloroquine in the prevention of COVID-19. Despite the negative results in the trials, many researchers are still keen or planning a new trial on hydroxychloroquine. Researchers are interested in hydroxychloroquine because we do not have any safe and effective treatment for COVID-19 after several months into this pandemic. So they want to, our researchers want to find one effective treatment for this COVID-19. In contrast to clinical trials, several large observational studies have found significant improvement with the use of hydroxychloroquine, giving a strong reason to conduct more hydroxychloroquine studies. Except a few trials like the recovery trial, a majority of the trials, the published trials, had severe methodological issues, and they were reported by people who do not have any track record of publishing RCTs. Another important point related to hydroxychloroquine is that this drug has both antiviral and anti-inflammatory properties that many other trial drugs do not have. We have drugs for viral infection and we have drugs for inflammation. Last and the most important point is that hydroxychloroquine is a cheap, affordable, and accessible drug available to researchers to conduct research. The second drug that I would like to talk about is lopinavir, available in combination with ritonavir. This drug has identified after the emergence of first SARS outbreak in 2003 as having in vitro inhibitory activity against SARS-CoV virus. Lopinavir has activity both in vitro and animal models against the coronaviruses, and case reports have suggested that the combination of lopinavir with other drugs have resulted in viral clearance and improved survival. I found at least 3 RCTs from China that were published in a very reputable journals like Cell, The Lancet, and New England Journal of Medicine. All 3 RCTs found no significant difference between lopinavir and a comparator in terms of viral negative conversion or incidence of clinical improvement. Osborne et al. In their latest systematic benefit risk assessment paper using benefit risk action team BRAT framework found no clear benefit for the use of lopinavir compared to standard care in severe cases. Recovery trial also compared lopinavir with usual care, and they also did not find any significant difference in the primary endpoint of 28-day mortality, and the results were consistent in different subgroups of patients. There were also no evidence of beneficial effects on the risk of progression to the mechanical ventilation or length of stay for the lopinavir group. So in conclusion, there is a strong evidence from the clinical studies from RCTs that the combination of lopinavir and ritonavir is not effective against SARS-CoV-2 infection. The next is remdesivir, which is a broad spectrum antiviral drug. It is an inhibitor of RNA-dependent RNA polymerase with activity against a range of RNA virus, including coronaviruses. Remdesivir was first originally developed to treat hepatitis C and was then tested against Ebola virus disease, but was not effective for all of these viral infections. So this drug has been tested in recent trials, in a few trials to treat COVID-19. The results are promising, but not conclusive yet. In an RCT in China, comparing remdesivir and placebo among severe cases found no significant difference for viral negative conversion, clinical improvement, clinical recovery, and all-cause mortality. However, in a recent randomized controlled trial by Beagle et al., they found significant difference for all-cause mortality and also for clinical recovery. Goldman et al. Also found promising results in their randomized phase 3 clinical trial, where they compared 5-day course of remdesivir versus 10-day course of remdesivir. After these promising results in the recent trials, US has bought up almost all these stocks for the next 3 months of remdesivir, leaving none for UK and most of the rest of the world. So in conclusion, remdesivir is a promising drug, but we need more evidence from clinical trials because the current trials were mainly conducted in severe cases. So we need more trials in the different phases, especially mild and moderate cases, and also in different geographical locations. The next repurposed drug is favipiravir. It's an antiviral drug which selectively inhibits RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. And the evidence about this drug is still accumulating. And there are few studies available, clinical studies available on this drug, and they have mixed results. For example, Chen et al. In their RCT found that clinical recovery rate of day 7 does not significantly differ between favipiravir and arbitol group. In another study, Lau et al. Found no significant difference for clinical improvement when favipiravir was compared with lopinavir or with other drugs. However, there is one study, Kai et al. Uh, they performed an open label before-after control study and found a significantly higher improvement rate in chest imaging and faster viral clearance in favipiravir arm given with interferon compared to lopinavir with interferon. So in conclusion, a number of trials have been initiated in different countries. For example, Japan and India, they have started a phase 3 clinical trial involving favipiravir. So the findings of these trials will help establish the efficacy of this drug in treating COVID-19. So there are other investigational drugs, but the results are not significant. And also we have limited time. So I move on to the novel drugs and the targets. For the development of new targets and drugs, we have three options. First one, we develop novel drugs and targets. Second option is to develop add-on therapies. So we have the main therapy and then we add on some drugs to improve the clinical outcomes. And we also have vaccines. So beside the repurposed drugs used in the treatment of COVID-19, we also have witnessed the development of novel molecules that have shown promising in vitro activities against SARS-CoV-2 virus. A good example of novel drug is the development of beta-DN4 hydroxycytidine NHC as an orally bioavailable ribonucleoside analog with broad spectrum antiviral activity against various unrelated RNA viruses, including coronavirus. Sheehan et al. Actually discovered that this molecule potently inhibits coronavirus's replication in cell lines, is highly active against coronaviruses in primary human airway epithelial cells cultures, and is also effective against remdesivir-resistant coronavirus. A second option could be add-on approach, where rather than looking for drugs that directly interact with the key viral proteins inhibiting the replication, an alternative and possibly add-on approach is to dismantle the host cell machinery that enables the virus to infect the host cell and spread from one cell to another. For example, we can use host cell proteases as potential drug targets. Some of the drugs that they can dismantle host cell proteases include glycopeptide antibiotics, factor Xa inhibitors. Dexamethasone, which is also found to be effective in severe form of COVID-19, also inhibits protease activity. Again, hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, they also inhibit protease activity by increasing endosomal pH. That's how they produce their anti-inflammatory activity. So my last slide will talk about the another option, that is the use of neutrophil elastase inhibitors. This drug could be used, could be an ideal drug having antiviral property and also the anti-inflammatory property. These neutrophil elastase inhibitors block the neutrophil elastase activation and also blocks the damage to the lungs, connective tissues, leading to ARDS. They also block the S protein proteolytic activation, blocking the binding of SARS-CoV-2 virus on the host cells and also blocking the replication of SARS-CoV-2 virus. So in conclusion, finding the safe and effective treatment is a time-consuming process, it's a tiring process, requires advanced knowledge and skills, and more importantly, a coordinated effort. So researchers who are planning to conduct small and poorly designed clinical trials should support the big trials like WHO to find a safe and effective treatment. So that's all from my side, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sayed, for a very informative presentation. It is great to have an overview of the current treatments that are being tested or in clinical trials. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our second speaker, Dalia Dawood, Dalia is an associate editor for pharmacoeconomics and outcomes research in Research in Social and Administrative Pharmacy, RSAP, and she's also an associate professor in the Faculty of Pharmacy of Cairo University in Egypt. So Dalia is going to provide an overview on current treatments and perspectives based on the pharmacoeconomic side of treatments. So thank you for joining us, Dalia, and looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be presenting today on this very important topic at this stage of the pandemic. We're finding a cure is really now the way forward to get us out of this lockdown across all countries in the whole wide world. But before I start presenting, I would like to say that the views expressed in my presentation are those are mine, and I don't have any conflict of interest to declare. As we have seen from Shazad's presentation, we are really living at an infodemic in parallel to this pandemic. If you try to find research studies on COVID-19 that are registered on clinicaltrials.gov, last week there was over 2,000 clinical studies. And if you try to find papers on the topic in PubMed, you will find over 28,000 papers. So researchers and healthcare professionals are struggling to digest this information and make decisions based on this information. But we are not only the only one who are struggling. Even stakeholders who are involved in the process of developing drugs and taking drugs from trials to market are also in the same position. They have to digest this information and make decisions on it. And taking time is now a luxury, really. So a process that used to take years to complete, from regulatory approval to taking the drug through market access and putting it into guidelines, is now being conducted in months, and dare I say, even days sometimes. So regulatory approvals based on clinical trials that the EMA and FDA and MHRA here in the UK usually look at, and then the process after regulatory approval would have to be done through a market access approval, where some countries necessitate health technology assessment, a full health technology assessment, including looking at the clinical evidence and the cost effectiveness evidence and the budget impact, by organizations such as EQUIG in Germany or TLV in Sweden. And then the drugs could be included in clinical guidelines, or what we call sometimes treatment protocols in some countries, based on clinical effectiveness evidence in majority, such as the WHO guidelines, but also some institutions of clinical guideline developers include cost effectiveness and budget impact evidence before issuing their clinical guidelines. And the process doesn't usually stop there as well. There has to be post-marketing surveillance and pharmacovigilance studies to ensure the long-term safety of these drugs. However, this process that used to take years is now having to be completed very quickly. And it's not a cheap endeavor. Actually, research and development costs are rocketing, and the cost of having a drug introduced into the market, or the cost of drug development, is now estimated to be on average 1.3 million. This is slightly less than the earlier estimate of 2.28 billion, but it's still a huge amount of money in order to develop a drug and take it to market. And this is why public funding was essential in the case of the COVID-19 treatment development. Organizations such as the WHO, the NIHR in the UK, and NIH in the USA had to put a lot of funding into developing or looking for a treatment for COVID-19. However, this is the time for a word of caution that speed is not always a good thing, and we have to be very cautious about the decisions we are making now, because it's time for global and national players to revert to the known, well-tried and tested methods of deciding which drugs to recommend for wider use in the population, such as health technology assessment, because this allows them to compare both the clinical and the cost effectiveness of all the technologies that are being developed for COVID-19 and make their decision based on the evidence, value for money, and through a well-designed process. And we have seen the problem with the speed very clearly over the last months with the high-profile article retractions from journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet for the hydroxychloroquine studies. And these result in confusion and knee-jerk reactions. And we have seen that the WHO had to change its course on whether to continue its trial on hydroxychloroquine due to the safety fears instigated by these retracted articles. And within 1 day, the decision was back again to continue the trial arm. So really speed is also welcome because we need to address the pandemic. It's not always a good thing. And we have to be very careful going forward because of reputational damage and issues related to patient safety. But we can appreciate why the organizations are taking this very accelerated processes in order to find a treatment for COVID-19, because we are seeing a pandemic that we have seen no other before that looks like it. The disease burden for COVID-19 is increasing by the minute. We have now over 10 million cases. On Saturday, it was past 11 million cases, and we have over 500,000 deaths worldwide. We have to focus on the excess mortality, of course, and in health economic terms, quality adjusted life years lost. However, it's still a huge disease burden. And if we take into account the complications and the long-term impact and damage, even for those who recover from COVID-19, then it's a huge disease burden. We are seeing reports of vascular, cardiovascular, new onset diabetes, and neurological and psychological impact for COVID-19, which is going to be a huge disease burden going forward. And all of this has its economic impact. We have seen countries' GDP falling. Even the World Bank estimated that there will be 5.2% lower loss in the gross, or the global economy will contract this year by 5.2%. And this hasn't been seen since World War II. And the UN estimated that the coronavirus outbreak could cost the global economy up to $2 trillion this year. It's a huge economic impact that's racking up every day. But with all the deaths and the humanistic impact, we also see the economic impact of these deaths. If we see the value for each of the deaths averted, it's been estimated to be in the range of $500,000 international dollar. So you can imagine, with all these lives lost, how much is the economic loss parallel with it. And in this context, you can see also how important it is to have treatments and the value of these treatments once available. But we need to look carefully whether these treatments are essentially guaranteed to be cost effective, or there are factors that we need to consider when we assess their cost effectiveness before their approval for wider use and for populations across the globe. And this is why we've decided to look at the previous evidence on the cost effectiveness of antivirals by conducting a review that aimed at informing the COVID-19 drug development efforts in order to identify the key drivers of the cost effectiveness of antivirals. We followed a standard systematic review process, so looking at previously published economic evaluations on the topic of using antivirals for pandemics and respiratory and outbreaks of influenza-like illnesses. So, for example, during the previous pandemics like the SARS, MERS, and H1N1. We conducted the search on the 26th of March, which now feels like ages ago, and that's why we're currently updating the review. And we included only the economic evaluation that assessed antivirals for these pandemics and outbreaks in the recent 10 years. This has inevitably resulted in us only identifying drugs that were used during the H1N1 outbreak. But any older studies will have limited applicability anyway in an economic context to the current practice. So what did we find with this review? We identified 14 full economic evaluations, and these are studies that compare not only the costs of the interventions, but costs and effects of the interventions in order to decide whether the intervention offers value for money over and above current practice or other interventions that are available. And all the studies that we have identified were actually conducted in high-income countries. So there's very limited, if any, evidence from low and middle-income countries. The studies we included compared antiviral treatment as an intervention to other pharmaceutical as well as non-pharmaceutical strategies. So studies looked at vaccination, antiviral prophylaxis, social distancing, border closure, school closures, as well as combinations of these strategies. So some studies looked at up to 48 strategies, to combat the pandemic and compare their costs and effects in order to identify which ones are cost-effective use of resources. All the studies identified, as I said, covered the H1N1 outbreak. What did we find from this review? We found that the most commonly used regimen during the H1N1 pandemic was the oseltamivir. In some analyses, they included zanamivir and peramivir for one of them. However, it was surprising that none of these have been really a focus during the COVID-19 pandemic drug treatment developments for COVID-19. The majority of the studies, or almost all of them, showed that antiviral treatment was found to be either cost-saving or cost-effective at the study-specific willingness to pay threshold. So it was reassuring that antiviral treatment is actually a cost-effective intervention to pursue. We also looked at studies about guiding the prescribing of antivirals. So some studies compared treatment of all those who present with symptoms compared to test-guided treatment, so basing the treatment decision on PCR results. And we found that empirical treatment or treatment based on clinical judgment, even before the test results are available, is likely to be cost-effective, particularly for the older population. So rather than waiting for the test results, treatment should start straight away. For all these studies, we saw that there was the assumption that antiviral treatment was assumed to start early, so within 48 days of the start of the symptoms. And this is supported by current clinical evidence that antivirals are most effective during the early phase of the viral illness. And it coincides with what is known now about COVID-19, where there is an early viremic phase followed by inflammatory phase. So that to ensure effectiveness of antivirals, they usually should be used in the early stage of the disease course. And we identified the main drivers that allow antivirals to be cost-effective or drive the cost-effectiveness of antivirals. Of course, we found that antiviral effectiveness is a major factor in that. The higher the efficacy, the better the cost-effectiveness of the antiviral. But also there were factors related to the pandemic itself, so the prevalence, viral basic reproduction number, case fatality rate, and also the level of adherence to other pharmaceutical intervention. So if it's difficult to keep social distancing or to keep or hand washing, then the more difficult and the lower the adherence to these measures, the better the cost effectiveness of the antiviral. However, another factor that was less on the list of the drivers is the antiviral cost, and this is understandable because in these studies it was compared to very costly interventions such as lockdowns and school closures. But going forward, I think antiviral cost will become a major driver of deciding the cost effectiveness of treatment. And we can see this with the latest comparison that we are seeing all over the news now between remdesivir and dexamethasone. So remdesivir was the main pivotal trial study preliminary results, as Shazia indicated as well, was published on the 22nd of May, while that of dexamethasone was published on the 22nd of June. The contrast is big between both of them, where remdesivir is a branded drug and is taken intravenously, while dexamethasone is a generic drug and it's taken either orally or intravenously. But both of them are used in the same, almost the same patient population, or trialed in the same patient population, which is the hospitalized patients with severe COVID-19. The trial for remdesivir was smaller in size compared to the recovery trial, which informed the dexamethasone approval. Or use. This was a UK trial, as we indicated before, and it had 6,425 patients that were studied in the dexamethasone arm and compared to standard of care. So how did this happen? Remdesivir actually was first introduced in, as we knew, in a press release, first of all, the results. And the results showed that there is a reduction in mortality, although that's not significant. And there's a reduction in median recovery time by 4 days. So the length of the clinical symptoms is reduced by 4 days. But again, this effect is not significant. And immediately in the USA, the Institute of Clinical and Economic Review started an economic analysis in order to inform the pricing of remdesivir based on these results. And their value-based price benchmark that they arrived at the time on the 1st of May was $4,460 per course of treatment. And this is assuming it is having a mortality benefit. However, as soon as the trial results for dexamethasone were published, now you had a clear winner in terms of a comparison. The mortality, the effect of dexamethasone on mortality was huge. Even ICU clinicians said that they haven't seen it before. Mortality was reduced by 20 to 33%, and this is depending on which subgroup we are talking about, whether those on oxygen or those who require ventilation. But overall, even across the whole population, it was a significant benefit in terms of mortality. The price of dexamethasone is around $15 per course of treatment. So you can see the stark difference between dexamethasone and remdesivir value-based benchmark. So this is why the ICER reviewed its calculations in light of the dexamethasone results and released an update of this analysis on the 24th of June, saying that now the price is almost 50% less that remdesivir should aim for, or that makes it cost effective, is almost 50% less than what they estimated before the introduction of dexamethasone. So we can see that the price really is going to be a driver for the cost effectiveness of antivirals. And their estimate still is based on an assumed mortality benefit for remdesivir. So we have to be really looking at what is available out there now. Before we had a clear sheet, so any drug that's coming in is likely to be a cost-effective use of resources. But with having an effective treatment that is cheap, is likely to dominate or to be better in terms of effectiveness and cheaper in terms of costs compared to new antivirals. So the benchmark is really much higher now for antivirals. And we have to be careful about which ones we choose to recommend and to use within our population, because we have to choose wisely. Basic principles of pharmacoeconomics say that if a drug is not effective, it's not cost effective. So drugs like hydroxychloroquine and lopinavir-ritonavir combination, or Caletra, both of them has been found to have no clinical benefit in hospitalized patients with severe COVID-19 in the recovery trial. And both of these arms stopped in the trial. The WHO also stopped these arms in its solidarity trial. So we know now that these are not effective in the severe patients who are hospitalized, and they would be better used in their original indications. So we are now depriving patients who are taking these for rheumatoid diseases and for HIV from having them available, because we think that they are effective in these indications. And now we have clear evidence that they are not effective for COVID-19. So they really represent better value in their original indications. And continuing to use these medications will represent a huge pressure on the supply of these drugs. Repurposed drugs are used, as I said, in other indications, and manufacturing capacity is a rate limiting step. Even if for the newer drugs that will be coming in, we have to be very cautious about what is the manufacturing capacity that is available. As we have seen that the USA started stockpiling remdesivir, for example, and some countries reverted to export restrictions for dexamethasone in order to combat this problem. So we can see the response for the USA stockpiling of remdesivir, so also Australia started stockpiling it as well. And this is not the right decisions to make, especially in the case of remdesivir, as we have seen that there is a modest benefit for the drug. And some people are of the view that we actually shouldn't care about the USA stockpiling this drug, why the rest of the world actually should be glad to be at the back of the queue, and should we really care? And kind of you can see the point for this view that it's likely to be overpriced given its efficacy data. It's not a breakthrough drug, and it's not as effective as it has been put forward at the start. The price is now have been announced by Gilead Sciences to be at $2,340 for a 5-day course. but we're still not sure about its efficacy in earlier patients. And also there are a lot of uncertainties around its effectiveness. We also know that the production cost recovery price for it is estimated to be $10 per 10-day treatment course. And that's not taking into account the research and development cost. If we add this, it would be around 1,010. So still overpriced for its efficacy data. And we also now have generic manufacturing that is started for remdesivir under voluntary licensing agreements. So generic manufacturing started in India, Pakistan, and in Egypt at prices that is around 80% of its price in higher income countries. So we have a supply that is likely to be available, but also only for low and middle income countries. So at least the need there would be satisfied. But it's the principle, actually. Stockpiling is not a principle that we should upload. It shouldn't be acceptable because no one is safe until everyone is safe. And also it's good to have an alternative for those who cannot have dexamethasone. So these are issues that we need to keep in mind when we think about any new antivirals that are coming to the market. We have to look at their effectiveness data alongside their costs and alongside any other comparators that are available at the time. And we still have more to come. We have to be prepared that studies are ongoing actually to look at the cost effectiveness, at the effectiveness of this drug in real world. So observational studies are now being set up, big ones like the Project Stella by Odyssey Network, that is now looking at the effectiveness of all treatments that have been trialed for COVID-19 using real world data. And also there will be coming through post-marketing surveillance studies for newly approved drugs on their safety. So these data should be taken into account and used in updating any cost effectiveness estimates or assessment of the new drugs. So we have to look at the efficacy results alongside the safety, alongside the costs. And we have to compare all the relevant alternatives before we make a decision to recommend any of them for wider or population level use. We have to collect resource use data and costs alongside the clinical outcomes in the studies that are being conducted. This will inform future developments and future update of economic models that look at the cost effectiveness of these drugs, as it happened with ICER review, where it updated its analysis based on new data for dexamethasone, as we have shown. So my final take-home message is do keep up to date with the information, but focus on the main ones, as Shazad also highlighted, the key clinical trials that are likely to provide the answers and are likely to be the ones which will shape the landscape for COVID-19 treatment. Also, we need to think about innovative pricing approaches for this treatment across the globe in order to ensure access and affordability. And we also need to focus at the unmet clinical need in the earlier stages of the disease pathway, so the mild and moderate COVID-19 patients. There is a huge need there for treatments, and antivirals can be well positioned in this stage of the disease pathway. So thank you so much and stay safe. And I'm giving back control to Victoria for question time.
Thank you, Dalia, for again a very informative presentation. I think it is great to have the pharmacoeconomic perspective and see how it can drive decisions in healthcare. So thank you very much. Now we are going to be focusing on questions and answers. So we already have a few from our participants. So I will be asking a few of those. Let's see how we go with the time. So we will just start with the questions from the question and answer chat. So we have the first one, and I think it is for Sayed. So what about the use of hydroxychloroquine in the antiviral therapy in children?
The question is about hydroxychloroquine use in children. So it's not tested, it's only tested for adult patients. So we don't have enough data available for for recommending hydroxychloroquine for children. Because even for adult patients, the data, the studies, if you look at the results, are mixed. Some studies, especially observational studies, they have produced very positive results. But many clinical trials, including recovery trials, they do not produce any significant results for COVID patients. So there is no specific trial I'm not aware of specifically on children. So we can't really recommend for children based on the available evidence.
Thank you very much. With a lot of current information, but sometimes lack of supporting evidence, how should we decide the proper treatment for the disease?
Is it for me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it was after your presentation.
Yeah.
It's not directed.
Okay.
Yes.
So like Dalia mentioned, that we have to look at the important trials. We have to really, follow them, get the results and read the results, what results they are getting, because the treatment actually depends on what is coming out from the important clinical trials. Currently, what they are giving, they have actually divided the treatment into the treatment for COVID-19, and then we have treatment for severe cases. Like dexamethasone, they have produced very good results in recovery trial for severe cases, but we don't have any similar results for antiviral drugs, like what we got for dexamethasone. So the best thing is that we look for, the big trials, the important trials, and see the results, and the treatment depends, on those clinical trials. Because rest all of means whatever suggestion or recommendations people are giving or using is not coming out from the clinical trials, is coming out from their practices, clinical practices, from their hospitals or institution. But to come up with a proper guideline, we need, data or evidence from proper big clinical trials.
Thank you very much. So the next one is very interesting, and perhaps both of you can give your perspective. So randomized controlled trials constitute the solid basis for the evaluation of efficacy of COVID-19 treatments. Outpatient pharmacies could also contribute to the recruitment by communicating the trials. Any experience with this?
I'd say any effort to encourage enrollment into these trials is really welcome, because even a negative result from this trial is an important result. So we know that these treatments are not effective, and we shouldn't be spending our resources on making them available. So really encouraging enrollment in these trials is very important. So far, as I said, the two big trials are focused on the hospitalized COVID-19 patients, and we don't have any credible trials, let's say, in the earlier stage of the disease. So I guess the outpatient pharmacists would be dealing with less severe cases. And I imagine that there might be starting some trials that would look at the earlier phases of the disease, and then we really need to encourage participation. But outpatient pharmacists should be able to do that, and it would be very welcome.
Thank you very much, Dalia. Next one is, have the consequences, and this is as well for you, Dalia, have the consequences of widespread misuse of antibiotics related to the pandemic been factored into the costing models?
Yeah, well, the previous models that we looked at in the studies that we have identified, some of them incorporated antimicrobial resistance that could develop from the use of antivirals, but not specifically antibiotics in that context. But definitely this is a very important factor that we have to take into account, and especially discourage the use of antibiotics in the early stages of this disease, because it's a viral illness. And the first stage of that, during the viremic phase, there's no need for antibiotics. There's no evidence that antibiotics are working in that stage of the disease. Even in the trials now, they are trialing azithromycin, but again, for the severe COVID-19 patients who are hospitalized. So we have to be very careful about the misuse of antibiotics during this time.
Thank you very much. There's also a very interesting comment. I think it has a lot of implications regarding the misuse of medicines by some patients and the accessibility of those patients to some medications. So we are also part of the Solidarity trial here in the Philippines, but we are discouraging the use of oral dexamethasone, since there is an easy access for patients even without prescriptions.
Yeah, I think, again, sorry Shazad, to jump in, but I'm a bit passionate about this particularly. These drugs are really for hospitalized COVID-19 patients who are severe cases that require oxygen support or ventilation. And we shouldn't be we have to be very careful. As pharmacists, we need to educate patients that these are not for use in the milder cases and shouldn't be available without a prescription for buying over the counter. More regulation. Perhaps there is a rule for governments now to step up regulation and make drugs available only on prescription. This is a time for taking action in this particular issue, especially in low and middle income countries.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, do you want to comment, Syed?
Yeah, because dexamethasone, or the steroid used in severe cases, is a life-saving drug. So is now already established in recovery trial, and there are earlier data also suggesting that this drug is useful in severe cases. If you are not giving this particular drug or make it available for patients with severe cases, I think it's not the appropriate decision.
Completely agree. So there are a couple of questions. One is about, what about ivermectin? So Syed, perhaps you can comment on that, and also the use of monoclonal antibodies for the treatment.
Ivermectin, yeah, is in use particularly in developing countries, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in some South Asian countries. I have seen the data, but there is no proper clinical trial. This all coming out from very small observational studies, and many of them are not significant. That's why I didn't discuss. I have seen those studies, but they were not significant in terms of the results, in terms of the participant number, and in terms of the design of the study. So yes, there are studies. Some studies, they have shown some improvement in patients, but the quality of the evidence is not good.
Thank you very much. I think you cover this. Sorry, Victoria, just to add the monoclonal antibodies. I just saw this morning that tocilizumab is also included as an arm now in the recovery trial. So yeah, there is trials now for the monoclonal antibodies that are stepping up, and essentially we should hear some news about their efficacy soon.
Thank you very much. And I think we will have time for a very final question. And I think, Syed, you discussed this in your presentation, but perhaps you can summarize the recent position of the World Health Organization on the lack of benefits of hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, hydroxychloroquine was initially offered in Solidarity trial, but after the recovery trial on 17 June, they actually dropped hydroxychloroquine, but they did not provide any results. They maybe used the results from the recovery trial and then they made the decision, but I haven't come across with any results of Solidarity trial about the use of hydroxychloroquine. So it's, I think, based on the recovery trial, they decided to stop hydroxychloroquine for the treatment of COVID-19. But now, because University of Oxford is starting a new trial for the prevention of COVID-19, they are using hydroxychloroquine. So I don't know whether WHO will be offering the same for the patients to prevent COVID-19.
Okay. And Dalia, final question for you. Should we be concerned about stockpiling? I think what happened with remdesivir is also going to happen with a vaccine when it comes around. Already half of the vaccines expected have been reserved for some countries. So any comments on this?
Yeah, I think we should stand firm against the stockpiling decisions and ensure at least for low and middle income countries, if we can increase manufacturing capacity, this is one thing that we can do in advance. But there is lobbying now definitely from the WHO, and there is Gavi who are ensuring that when a vaccine is made available, there will be access to for all low and middle income countries, and this hopefully this practice of stockpiling will not be allowed to prevent people who are in most need to access these vaccines. So there is a lot of lobbying on the international level to prevent this from happening. But definitely we need to be alarmed and to stand by our position that stockpiling is not acceptable at this stage.
Okay, thank you very much. Completely agree with that. So I think it is time to close this really informative and interesting webinar. So I would like to thank our two presenters for today, Dalia and Sayed. Thank you very much. I think both perspectives were great, and it gave us a really good overview of the current state of COVID-19 treatments from both the clinical and the economic perspective, which is great. So thank you everyone for your participation. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to go through all the questions, but I think with the ones that we discussed, we also got a good perspective from our speakers. So I would like to remind you to keep an eye on the upcoming webinars organized by FIP on the COVID-19 pandemic. The Pharmacy Practice Research Group is organizing two webinars, additional webinars, one in July and one in August, and they will be very interesting. We will discuss evidence-based practice topics. So yeah, we hope to see you soon, and thank you very much for your participation and for your attention. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.